Hey everyone, it's Allie, and today we're going to be making a highly requested video talking about all of the endgame unique items that you want for this build, as well as how to go about farming them. Now, all this is going to be put together from a Circle of Fortune perspective, as that is the thing that the majority of players are actually playing. Obviously, if you're playing this in Merchant's Guild, you can very easily just go and buy the items that we're going to be talking about on the auction house itself, but all the farming and all of the ways to obtain this is going to be from a Circle of Fortune perspective. So the first thing I'm going to want to talk about is how to go about effectively farming all these items. And I'm going to be using a Cradle the Erase as the example here, simply due to it being the most commonly asked question that I've seen so far from people. But again, I want you to keep in mind that this is going to apply for every single item that we're going to be talking today. You're going to be doing effectively the same methodology, with the exception of the amulets that we're going to go over. So if you are a Circle of Fortune player, you might have noticed that, well, prophecies are very good. Prophecies allow you to very easily go and target farm exactly what you want. And with the use of lenses that we have access to as we get to higher and higher Circle of Fortune ranks, we can very easily get whatever we want with relative ease. So as I mentioned, we are going to use a Cradle the Erase as the example for how you go about farming basically almost everything I'm about to mention. Now, if I were to want to get some of these myself, I have three options. First off, I can go over to End of Time. I could specifically farm in the Black Sun area. In this area, I have a chance to see nodes that will specifically give me a set or unique shield, and that is just a raw 1 in 12 or so chance for it to give a Cradle the Erase. The other option is to also use Runes of Ascendance. These are going to do the same thing, where it's just a raw 1 in 12-ish chance for a Cradle the Erase. But in my opinion, I would not really recommend to touch either of these, and I would specifically use Prophecies instead. So in the case of our Cradle the Erased, we would specifically want to come over to Arctis and use these Armor Prophecies to hunt down for a Cradle the Erased. Now, I know Eos is technically where all the shield nodes actually are, but these are not efficient to use because these shield nodes from here are going to give you about a 1 in 12 chance to see what you want, while at the same time being very expensive. If we were to instead go to Arctis, Arctis has a really amazing node that just gives you a guaranteed Weaver's Wool item. As you can see here, this node is going to give us 16 unique armors with 8 Weaver's Wool on it twice over, meaning in total, this will give us 32 Weaver's Wool items. Now, because it's going to only give you Weaver's Wool items specifically, that means it'll either give you the shield, the belt, the boots, or the gloves, giving you a 1 in 4 chance that this will just give you a Cradle the Erase. The other thing to mention here is that you do not want to do these that say 8 Weaver's Wool on them specifically. You want to do the ones that specifically have 16 Weaver's Wool on them, as getting yourself a Cradle with 8 Weaver's Wool basically guarantees it's never going to have anything good on them. To accompany all this and to augment this, we really want to be using lenses. Ideally, you're going to be wanting to use a Lens of Rhyme, which is going to give you double uses out of your prophecies, and a Lens of Wealth, which is going to give you double rewards. These are highly efficient to use, and they overall save you substantially more favor than they cost. And the other nice thing to mention here is if you are rank 10 of Circle of Fortune, the items from prophecies or duplicated point, if you were to, for example, get a Cradle the Erased, would give you 2 cradles, as it simply just duplicates whatever the outcome actually is. It doesn't give you double rewards from this. So that means I wouldn't get 4 unique armors with Weaver's Wool on it. I would still get 2. And then whatever that rolls, this would just give me 2 extra copies of whatever it is. Meaning that you can get yourself quite a lot of cradles very quickly farming this with Arctis. The other thing we should really quickly mention is what should you use in your third lens? So it really is going to depend on where you're going to farm. If you're looking to farm yourself Weaver's items, you just want to go and get yourself a greater lens that's going to give you a chance to find extra unique items. Now, this whole time I've been stupid and I didn't actually properly read how all these lenses work. Specifically for all of these ones that give you more of whatever you want, it's per rank, meaning that with me being at level 10 Circle of Fortune, if I were to use this increased chance to find daggers, this would give me a 200% increased chance to actually see daggers if I were to roll for daggers. Ideally, what you do is just use Lens of Rhyme and Lens of Wealth no matter what. And if you're looking to farm specifically Weaver's items, you would want to use the unique lens because you can't specifically target the Weaver's Wool node in any other way. If you're looking to farm the rings or the belt or the chest plate or the helmet or the weapons that I'm going to be benching in this, I would recommend your third slot to be that specific type. So for example, if you were looking to farm chest plates, you would use a chest plate lens as your third lens instead of using a unique lens as your third lens instead. Now, moving on next, let's talk about some of the other items that we want to include in this build. Again, these are also going to be farmed the same exact way as Cradle would have been farmed, except you'd be using the respective telescope to target farm the specific thing that you're looking for. Now, the next one we should talk about is going to be your Relic, Gambit of the Erased. Now, this is going to work exactly the same way that your Cradle of the Erased works. It's simply just a Weaver's item that is going to roll random modifiers that can roll on relics. Gambit's a really powerful item in this build, simply due to the fact it gives you +1 to all rogue skills, which is great because that's about a 5% DPS increase, and we get some really nice utility ability out of it. It gives us a bunch of flat dodge rating, which is also amazing. And at the same time, it gives us a 1 in 6 chance to take less damage per active shadow. And given that we pretty much always have 3 active shadows in this build, that's just a 1 in 6 chance to effectively negate every hit against us. Because there's no other good relic bases that we really want to include in this build, as most of them just kind of suck or aren't very good, getting these generic stats from Gambit are going to be a great way to increase our build. And at the same time, because they can roll generic stats, you can potentially get yourself a Gambit like this one, which has health on it and critical strike chance. There's quite a lot of options here, and it's just like Gambits to where there are quite a lot of decent outcomes. So realistically, it's going to be just like Cradle, where you just get a few of these, roll them, and see if they roll anything good on them. Moving on next, let's talk about the one single item which you will not be able to use Circle of Fortune to farm, and that is going to be Omnis. Now, Omnis is a very, very interesting item because it has a massive range in terms of what it can roll. All of the resistances on it can go from anywhere between 1 total resistance to 45 total resistance. This amulet, when combined with a all-res Cradle the Erase or some rings, which we'll be talking about later, can potentially fix all of your resistances just by itself, meaning that you don't actually need any resistances on any of your gear, meaning you can fit a lot more health and dodge rating suffixes everywhere, making you substantially tankier while only sacrificing an amulet slot, while at the same time giving you +1 to all skills, making it still at least give you some sort of an offensive bonus at the same time. Now, this amulet cannot be gotten through any other means other than specifically getting it from the Shade of Orbis. This amulet, the higher the corruption that you kill Shade of Orbis at, has a higher chance to drop. This item is something that you would never consider with LP, as getting legendary potential on Omnis is unbelievably rare on top of its already low drop rate. Because of all this, you're simply just looking for an Omnis that has a decent spread of resistance rolls on it. If you luck out and get yourself a pretty decent roll, then congratulations, you can pretty much completely kiss goodbye all resistance on your gear. And potentially, if you get yourself a really, really strong one and you have yourself a all-res Cradle the Erase, you could potentially even drop all the resistances on your idols, allowing you to fit in a bunch of damage idols instead. Moving on next, let's talk about the build for this build. So the only build you'll ever want to consider is going to be a Jungle Queen's Chasp Withholding. This is actually a really strong build for a build, and it's actually just a really strong leveling build in general. The main thing about this belt is that it has up to 10 dexterity as a raw roll on it, which is something we cannot obtain on a belt normally, as belt cannot roll for attributes. Dexterity not only is an amazing roll for us, but because of some of the other endgame items that we want to add into our build, we are going to need substantially more dexterity to be able to hit 180 total attributes. Not only that, but it also just gives you 30% increased dodge rating when you use a potion, which is amazing, as it's just going to make you a little bit tankier while running around. And at the same time, it's going to give you 10% more dodge rating that stacks multiplicatively on top of each other. That means if you were to press 10 potions in 4 seconds, you double your dodge rating, which means this belt can effectively be an on-demand panic button where you just spam all your potions, get a lot of health, and massively spike your dodge rating to very high levels, making you effectively just immune to damage for a few seconds when combined with the rest of the defensive layers that we have. Now, I need to make this painfully obvious to everyone here. You do not want to use a Jungle Queen's unless you specifically get 1 legendary potential on it and you specifically get cooldown recovery speed. This item is not worth replacing your build with unless it has CDR on it. CDR is way too vital to making this build feel good and way too vital to your DPS overall, meaning that if you were to drop the CDR on your belt, it's going to make the build feel just a lot clunkier. Upgrading your actual Exalted belt into a Jungle Queen's is very, very difficult to do. It's not going to be something that you're going to immediately be able to upgrade into. Please just don't use a raw Jungle Queen's. You will just overall be making your build worse. Moving on next, we have a helmet. So for the helmet in this build, you can either just choose to use a falconry helmet that is very well rolled with dexterity and with word gain when you create a shadow, or you can eventually upgrade into a Face of the Mountain. Now, the beautiful thing about Face of the Mountain is that it's just going to give you a lot of crit chance and a few total attributes at the same time, making up for some of the dexterity that you lose on your falconry helmet. This critical strike chance is going to be given to your bird, meaning that this by itself with a little bit of extra crit chance in the rest of your gear should crit cap your bird, making you always have a 100% chance to crit. The other beautiful thing about this is because this helmet basically has no stats on it, the chance of you getting legendary potential on it is very high. And what I'd recommend here is to not use a Peak of the Mountain unless it specifically has at least 3 legendary potential on it. This is not an item you can farm through prophecies, and this is an item that only comes specifically from the Lightless Abhor dungeon. You can do any tier of Lightless Abhor, meaning you don't have to do tier 4, and because it has about a 4% chance to drop with 3 LP, it's actually a pretty reasonable item to farm, on average requiring you to do somewhere around 30 Lightless Abhor runs to see yourself a 3 LP helmet. The thing about this is you are going to need to get some good rolls on it, and if you don't manage to put the ward gained when you create a shadow roll on it, personally I would farm yourself a new Face of the Mountain, simply due to that roll being so crucial to us being able to stay alive. Up next, we have the chestplate you might want to consider for this build. Previously, Kestrel used to be called Falcon, and it actually used to be a pretty garbage chestplate, only offering you 50% increased movement speed. It was a really good chestplate for basically any build that didn't require any specific chestplate to get it going, but due to the fact that it wasn't that powerful. It wasn't really an item that you really wanted to chase down. It was just something that if you end up getting yourself one of these, great. The other thing about it was that because it was such a weak item, the chance of you getting a 4 LP one was actually relatively high. It was basically one of the highest chance to get 4 LP items in the game, period. And because it's so common, it's just very easy to actually go and farm yourself one of these. Now, with the release of the game, they have renamed it to the Kestrel, and they have massively buffed it to where this chestplate is just cracked now. The thing about this is that they have not changed the rarity of it at all, making getting a 4 LP version of this chestplate just as common as it used to be before. Because of this is going to absolutely beat running any other base chestplate, as the stats on a Kestrel are just way too good to pass out on. Now, I want to mention here that if you get yourself a 2 LP Kestrel or 1 LP Kestrel, you should not use it at all. The only Kestrel you're going to ever want to consider is specifically a 3 or 4 LP Kestrel. A 3 LP Kestrel has about a 4% chance to drop every time you get a Kestrel, meaning it's fairly likely for you to actually get one, while 4 LP Kestrel is about a 0.5% chance every time you see a Kestrel, meaning on average you will need to drop 200 Kestrels, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't that many Kestrels given just how common it actually is to drop if you were to use Circle of Fortune Prophecies to farm it. Now, what I want to mention about this is you most likely are not going to want to use a Kestrel that doesn't have the ward gained when you create a shadow roll on it. This roll is so crucial to keeping us alive, especially in high corruption, that I really would just recommend to farm a new Kestrel if you don't actually manage to get the roll onto the chestplate itself. And finally, for the non-very stupid items to attempt to farm is going to be your weapons. Now, for the weapons, you actually have 2 choices that you can go for here. You have a Smoke Weaver, which is going to be the more defensive option, and you have a Drought's Release, which is going to be the more utilitarian option, or the more there's nothing else to really use option. So in the case of both these daggers, they aren't really that useful. As you can see, most of the stats on them just don't apply to us at all. In Smoke Weaver's case, the reason we want to use it is just the massive amount of raw dodge chance that it actually provides us. When we combine this with a Jungle Queens, and when we combine this with some percent dodge scaling, we can actually put ourselves at around 40 to 50% dodge chance at all times, not including the dust shrouds that we can give ourselves from Smoke Bomb. Basically, this is going to allow you to set higher dodge ratings substantially easier, making your build feel overall tankier when pushing high corruption. The problem with this dagger is that getting any sort of legendary potential on it is very rough. Even getting a 2 LP Smoke Weaver is kind of difficult to do, pretty much just as rare as getting, for example, a 4 LP Kestrel. A 3 and a 4 LP Smoke Weaver are basically off the table in terms of rarity. They're just not going to happen. So that means you are going to lose quite a lot of damage out of your dagger, but if you feel like you need the defensiveness of a Smoke Weaver, it is going to be a worthwhile trade-off. Now, in a Drought's Release case, it's actually very easy to get high LP on this. The other problem with it is it doesn't really give you much at all. The only useful roll on Drought's Release is the +3 to all attributes, which might actually become so important for a build when we go and talk about rings next, that getting this might be a kind of mandatory upgrade for the build. The beautiful thing about this is because it's just such a simple dagger, it's actually very easy for you to get high LP versions of this. It's just as common for you to see a 4 LP Drought's Release as it is for you to see a 4 LP Kestrel, making this a very reasonable item to get as 4 LP, with it having around a 4% chance to drop as a 3 LP item, meaning it's going to be very easy to get yourself a 3 legendary potential version of it, getting the majority of your dagger stats back onto this Drought's Release, making you not really lose too much. Obviously, you're going to be losing a tiny little bit of damage, as you're not going to have 4 useful mods, but it's really not that big of a deal, especially when considering that a Drought's Release is a Chris, meaning that we are going to be gaining up to 65% crit multi just from the implicit alone, potentially actually just making a 3 LP Drought's Release a overall upgrade, even over a pretty well-rolled dagger. And finally, let's talk about the items that you most likely will never see. Cuties, I need you to be painfully aware that the next 2 items we're going to talk about, the rings and the gloves, are basically the same rarity as Mageblood in Path of Exile, if you know what a Mageblood is. I need you to understand that attempting to get these items is basically impossible to do, and these are mostly going to be, you are going to chase these down as super endgame upgrades for a build, rather than something that you're going to immediately want to farm. To get this point across, the first item we're going to be talking about, the Red Ring of Altaria, is so rare, and it's been the thing that I've been personally farming over the past few days, that I not only have 1 full tab of rings, 2 full tabs of rings, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and soon to be 8 full tabs of rings that I farmed attempting to get myself a Red Ring of Altaria. As you can see, these are very rare, and the same is going to go for the gloves that we talk about. Please know what you're getting yourself into if you're attempting to farm these items, but at the same time, I need you to be aware that this ring and the pair of gloves that we're going to be mentioning, Ravenous Void, are going to literally be almost best in slot for every single build in the game. This is not specifically an item that you'd only farm for this build. If you were to get yourself a Red Ring of Altaria, this is something that you consider for literally every single build in the game that can actually meet the requirements to put it on. So why is Red Ring of Altaria such a rare item and such a powerful item that would put myself through the pain and torture of grinding 8 tabs of rings to attempt to get? Well, The biggest thing in this game is defensive layers. If we want to push higher and higher corruption, we are not going to struggle with damage, especially in this build given just how much damage it does. The thing that we care about is going to be taking less damage, and Red Ring of Altaria gives us 10% less damage taken if we get 180 total attributes. As I remember earlier, I was alluding to a Drough's Release potentially being a really good item in this build, and that is due to 3 attributes that effectively gives us 15 total attributes towards the Red Ring requirement. Putting on a Red Ring is going to be fairly difficult, but it's actually kind of reasonable to do in our build, given that with an endgame setup, by the time you're actually farming for a Red Ring, you most likely are going to be having somewhere around 100-ish dexterity, and you might have a few other attributes on your gear from some other random rolls. Getting to the 180 requirement from this point isn't too bad to do, given that the Red Rings themselves give you anywhere between 20 to 40 attributes themselves, realistically meaning that you only need to get to about 140 total attributes between attributes you're stacking yourself to manage to build it on. You can potentially use relics to get to that, as you can get yourself vitality rolls on your relics, which are going to push you a little bit closer, while at the same time, you are just going to have to make sure your gear is as min-max as possible, making sure you have dexterity literally everywhere. Meaning the requirements with a pretty min-max setup is not that difficult to do and just requires a little bit of tinkering with your gear. And if you, for example, have a Jungle Queens, it's going to massively help you due to you being able to get attributes on an item that typically doesn't have attributes. The one thing I need you to be aware if you are going to farm a Red Ring is that you do not want to even attempt to farm one before you are level 10 with Circle of Fortune. The reason for that being is that the level 10 reward for being with Circle of Fortune is that all items from prophecies are duplicated, and this happens after the item is rolled. This means if I were to do a ring prophecy and one of the 6 rings that would drop from this prophecy is a red ring, that red ring would then be duplicated, immediately giving me 2 red rings at the same time. You really do not want to try to go for this item, because if you do end up getting yourself a red ring from the prophecy, you effectively just missed out on a secondary red ring, making you have to do the farm for a red ring twice over. Now, the other item that we should talk about as the mega rare item is going to be Ravenous Void. If you just skipped this section of the video, please watch what I just said about the ring that was literally 2 minutes ago, as that is going to give you a lot of the information on why this item is going to be just as rare and just how much of a grind it actually is to farm. But Ravenous Void are literally going to be as rare as Red Ring of Altaria, and again, these are basically best in slot in almost all builds in the game. Ravenous Void, and the reason we want to use them, is not only do they have very strong implicits, giving us vitality and increased health, but at the same time giving us less damage taken from void damage and giving us an increased endurance threshold, meaning we're going to overall be tankier. The main thing about Ravenous Void, and the reason I care about them, is going to be the void barrier stacks that they're going to give us, effectively giving us a permanent 15% less damage taken multiplier while 3 stacks of void barrier are active. Now, the other thing to mention here is if you're ever to drop below your endurance threshold, which if you hover over your health globe, you can see as a little yellow line at the bottom, the Ravenous Void are going to double their effect, giving you 30% less damage taken for a few seconds before taking all of the barriers away and putting a really nasty dot on you. Now, the thing about this is that this dot is going to turn off all of your leech, and that means if you were a leech-based build, that is a massive downside, meaning you basically cannot heal yourself. But given the fact that our build has insane recovery, and we don't really care about leech in general, we never had leech in our build, we don't really care about the nasty dot that they're going to put on us if we ever fall low. And at the same time, we can always get ourselves a ailment cleansing roll on our potion, or we can get ourselves cleansing steam and smoke bomb to just remove the dot, which then immediately makes the gloves work once again. Because they're effectively a 15% less damage taken multiplier and an on-demand 30% less damage taken multiplier when we get low, these gloves are basically unbeatable, and they're going to make you so tanky that you are not going to have any issue pushing higher corruption. The thing about these gloves is obviously you'd be giving up a little bit of dexterity and a little bit of armor shred or other useful stats in your gloves, and this is why I would recommend for you to farm these as the last thing in the build, farming these after a Red Ring of Altaria, as you're most likely going to want to keep your glove slot the way it is to be able to benefit from any of the stats they currently have on it. Now, another thing to mention here is while you're on the Ravenous Void grind, you most likely are going to get yourself a pair of Riverbend Grasp. Now, Riverbend Grasp is a pretty solid pair of gloves, giving us some really nice stats for a build, but in my opinion, I don't really think that these are strong enough for you to consider just using them as they are. And if you did want to include a Riverbend Grasp into your build, I would recommend that you at least get yourself a 3LP variant of them. And you could potentially go for a 2LP version of Riverbend Grasp if you were to roll good mods on them, such as Dexterity and Hybrid Health. Otherwise, I would not recommend to use these unless you just happen to get yourself a pair of these while you're just starting off the build. Unless these have LP on them, I really wouldn't recommend them at all. And that's all we have to talk about in this video, kitties. I hope this answered your question about all the items you might want to eventually chase down for this build and the reasoning behind them and how you can go about farming basically anything that we mentioned here. If you somehow managed to get yourself 2 red rings and a Ravenous Void, congratulations. Not only do you have a best in slot setup for basically almost every build in the game, but you have made yourself an absolutely cracked setup for Falconer, and you should have no issue pushing a few hundred corruption pretty easily with a build. As always, kitties, if you have any questions on anything that we discussed discussed here, feel free to leave a comment in the description below, and I'll be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have on there. Or if you just simply want to come by and be a part of our community, I'll be more than happy to see you around. With that said, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and hope to see cuties in the next video.